Greetings, everyone, and welcome to today's reading of poetry from around the world, featuring Najwan Darwish, Arundhati Subramaniam, Atef Alshaer, and Paul Batchelor, and sponsored by the Poetry Translation Center, based in London but working throughout the UK to bring the greatest contemporary poets from Asia, Africa, and Latin America into English. Please feel free as you're watching on YouTube to drop any questions you have for our poets and translators into the chat box. And after our readings, we will engage them in a conversation. And they're really eager to hear what you think of their readings, what questions you have for them. So please do that. And also keep in mind that you can get both Najwan and Arundhati's books through the links that will be available on the YouTube channel. It's a great pleasure today to introduce our first reader, Arundhati Subramaniam, who divides her time between Bombay and New York. Bloodaxe published her first UK selection, Where I Live, New and Selected Poems, in 2009, combining selections of work from two Indian collections with new poems. Her 2014 collection, When God is a Traveler, was shortlisted for the T.S. Eliot Prize. She's also written The Book of Buddha, published by Penguin in 2005, and Sadhguru, More Than a Life, also Penguin, 2010. She's the co-editor of Confronting Love, an anthology of Indian love poems in English, and also edited Pilgrim's India, an anthology, and Eating God, a book of bhakti poetry. Her latest collection, from which she'll be reading today, was just published by Bloodaxe, and it's called Love Without a Story. Welcome, Arundhati.
Thank you, David. I just want to say that I know that I'm part of a session that focuses on translation. My book is in English. I'm an Anglophone poet, but I have done a fair amount of work in translation. And I think flavors of that will probably enter the reading as I read, as I pick poems from this new book. And I'm going to start with the very first poem in the book. I don't know how many of you have admired the work of a poet and then made the mistake of meeting her or him. It can sometimes be an anticlimax from which it can take a lifetime to recover. So this is a wise line from an Indian poet called Eunice D'Souza. In one of her poems, she writes, "Best to meet in poems." And that becomes the epigraph of this poem. I grew up in an age of poets. I grew up in an age of poets who told me joy was for cabbages, until I found that beneath their smoking empires of sulfur, there lay a shiver of doubt, that they wondered, as I did, about what it might mean to be leafy, to wilt, to be damaged sometimes by upstart caterpillars, and still stay green, chaotically, wetly, powerfully, green. Today, I meet poets who exchange visiting cards, are best friends with the dentist, all dankness deodorized, their poems cool seashells, their laughter splintered eggshells, poets who never seem to wonder about cabbages at all. Still best to meet in poems. And I'd like to move on to a poem that was actually triggered by a conversation I had when I was in the UK some years ago with a reader who asked me how to interpret, how to read Indian myth. And the question was prompted by the fact that I had an entire poem cycle in my book with an Indian mythic figure at the center. And my immediate response to her was, just don't be anxious about it. And I didn't want to be I didn't want to say very much more because I knew her question was a very real one. So I didn't really want to say that in fact, most of us in India grow up reading about all kinds of other mythologies, and we have to take it in our stride because that's been part of the whole post-colonial experience for us. But her question was real, and I just felt that it merited a sensitive answer. And I wanted really to tell her that it's absolutely fine to read myth and forget all about it, to read a poem and not try to understand it, because that is the quality of mythology. You recognize it deeply, even before you understand it. How to read Indian myth. How to read Indian myths? The way I read Greek, I suppose. Not worrying too much about foreign names and plots. Knowing there is never a single point to any story. Taking the red hibiscus root into the skin. Alert to trapdoors, willing to blunder a little in the dark. Slightly drunk on Deccan sun. But with a spring in the step that knows that we are fundamentally corky, built to float, built to understand, and that the chemical into which we are tumbling will sustain, has sustained before. Knows a way through, knows a way beyond, knows that the two aren't separate. Read it like you would read a love story, your own. And with that piece of advice, it feels absolutely right to, in fact, plunge into a poem that has a mythic figure at the center. And this particular cycle of poems, to me, lies at the very center of this book. And there's really nothing much you need to know about this woman who's at the center of this poem cycle, other than the fact that her name is Avayar. She's from the southernmost part of India. She's an old woman, a wise woman, something I would certainly aspire to be. And she's a poet, and she's a traveler, and she's a mythic character. And I was trying to understand Avayar, and I wanted to know what it was that made this woman voluntarily choose old age. What was it that would impel someone to do that? Because that is the story of Avayar. So this is my attempt to understand her. And I'm just going to read a few extracts from the cycle and then maybe one small poem from it. Avayar seems to, in my poem at least, look at all the entire litany of ingredients on skin creams, collagen, spirulina, vitamin E, macadamia nuts, extracts of green tea, triclosan, selenium, propylene glycol, alpha hydroxy acids, bergamot, retinol. Avayar is impressed with none of it. Avayar makes another choice. Fearless friend to gods, ally of peasants, counselor to kings, traveler of the darkest streets. She walks the world alone. And on such a path, she says, it's best to be a crone. Avayar lives in a face where the civil war is almost over. She's so light, she can finally take herself seriously. One way to outwit death, she says, is to invite it over, wear it. Nothing to declare anymore, she says, not even nostalgia. For lovers flatten into photographs, photographs into reminiscence, reminiscence into quiet. And then what's left? Perhaps just the oldest thing in the book, love without a story. What is it that Avayar knows? This was something that made me curious about her. What is it that she knows that we don't? Avayar knows that tyrannical algebra teachers die. And timid cleaning ladies with floral aprons too. She knows that oligarchic poets blur into fussy grandpas, that dashing bankers get dementia, and the prettiest girls in class always slash their wrists in beach homes, felled by boredom and barbiturates. She knows that the aging ustad is eventually ousted by triglycerides and court politics, and the silent acolyte with smoldering eyes and humid palms. She knows every court must have its oily pandit, its bleating groupies, its sullen cavillers, its jester stoned on his own demagoguery. She knows every sangha has its devadatta, plotting his coup in a blue swirl of power lust. She knows that everyone, everywhere believes they've been wronged, that history was written by someone else, and that they're always right. And so, Aveyar says, the thing about age is seeing through the game, but still being able to smile at those who play it. And with that, I'm going to leave Aveyar and move to a contemporary woman, a woman who's been an important part of my life. There are many poems in this book that are about friends and parents and lovers. And this particular poem is about my mother. I don't know how many of you have felt this way, but I often felt growing up that parents were just like the backdrop to my life. And just the background context, I never really saw them as individuals. But there comes a point in one's life when one suddenly turns and realizes that, oh my God, this is actually an autonomous, full-fledged person. That jolt of recognition became this poem. When landscape becomes woman. I was 8 when I looked through a keyhole and saw my mother in the drawing room in her hibiscus silk sari, her fingers slender around a glass of iced cola. And I grew suddenly shy for not having seen her before. I knew her well, of course. Serene undulation of blue malmal, wrist serrated by thin gold bangle, the gentle convexity of mole on upper right arm, and her high arched feet, better than I knew myself. And I knew her voice like running water, ice cubes in cola. But through the keyhole at the grown-up party, she was no longer geography. She seemed to know just when to incline her neck, just when to sip her swirly drink, and she understood the language of baritone voices and lacquered nails and words like emergency. I could have watched her all night. And that's how I discovered that keyholes always reveal more than doorways, that a chink in the wall is all you need to tumble into a parallel universe, that mothers are women. I'm going to move to a poem that uses as its epigraph a line from a South Indian woman mystic of the 12th century. And since this is a session devoted to translation, it feels right to read this particular poem because this poet, Akka Mahadevi, has been marvelously translated by the iconic translator, A.K. Ramanujan. And the poem, her poetry stayed with me, has always stayed with me, but this particular line is something that made me pause and wonder. She says in one of her poems, "Friend, when will I have it both ways? To be with him, yet not with him." She's talking here about her personal God. And that started me thinking about what that meant, whether it's in the context of a love poem or a sacred poem. What does it mean, this desire to be with him, yet not with him? And that led to a poem called Remembering. Here's what I'm good at. When you're around, marinating. When you're not around, remembering. Nostalgia is reflex, just a spasm of cortical muscle. But this remembering isn't habit or even sentiment. This remembering is a slumbering, allowing main text to drift into marginalia, weekday into holiday, inhaling you as rumor, as legend, and suddenly as thing, superbly empirical, with your very own local scent of infinity. Let me follow river currents warm with sun, the ambling storylines of green lotus stems and wooden boats. Let me be that tangle of moonbeam and plankton on a journey too pointless to be pilgrimage, floating, jamming, just jetsamming. Remembering isn't an art, more an instinct, a knowing that there is nothing limited about body, nothing piecemeal about detail, nothing at all secondhand about remembering. And with that, I'm going to move on to, I don't think there's going to be time to read more than one, but I'm going to read one of the poems in the book, and there's more than one, that invokes the natural landscape, earth, mud, water, air, sky, the moon. All of them are a very integral part of this poem, of this poetry collection. And I'm going to read a poem called Mitti, which in Hindi means mud. And it feels right to read it here again at a session devoted to translation, because this was a word that was actually suggested to me. It came from a reader via a newspaper, and I was asked to incorporate it into a poem. And I was hesitant because I thought I was being asked to write a somewhat jingoistic, my motherland is better than your motherland, the soil of my motherland is superior kind of poem, which I didn't want to do. But I stayed with the word. And I'm glad I did, because it allowed me to reflect on the very notion of mud. It allowed me to reflect on languages, multiple languages, and the fact that really nothing is superior or inferior. And it allowed me to think about the role of the poet as well. Mitti, mud in Hindi. Mitti. As a child, I ate mud. It tasted of grit and peat and wild churning, and something else that I could never quite find a name for. Later, I became a moon gazer, always squinting through windows, believing that freedom was aerial, until I figured that the moon was a likely mud gazer, longing for the thick sludge of gravity, the promiscuous thrill of touch, the license to make, to break, to remake. And so I uncovered the old language of poets, to be messengers between moon and mud. And I began to uncover the many languages of earth that have nothing to do with nations and atlases, and everything to do with the ways of earwigs, the pilgrim trail of roots, the great longing of life to hold and be held, and the irrepressible human love of naming. Ooze, mire, manure, humus, dirt, silt, mold, loam, soil, slush, clay, shit, mann, matope, baro, tinen, ni, luto, fango, all have their place, I found, in the democracy of tongues. None superior, none untranslatable, all reminders of the anthem of muck of which we are made. Except when June clouds capsize over an Arabian sea and a sleeping city awakens to an ache so singular that for just a moment it could have no name. Other than that, where sound meets scent and a slop of matter meets a slick lunatic wetness, mitti. Just that, nothing else will do. And since I think I have a minute, I'm going to conclude with a fun poem. And it's a poem that was, it's a poem for women of a certain age, women who are constantly being reminded that their metabolic process is slowing down. So it's for women who are, in fact, disintegrating, but happily so. If any of you identify with that, here's a poem for you. It's called Song for Catabolic Women. We are bound for the ocean and a largesse of sky. We are not looking for the truth or living a lie. We are coming apart. We are going downhill. The fury is almost done. We've had our fill. We are passionate, ironic, angelic, demonic, clairvoyant, rational, wildly Indian, anti-national. We're not trying to make our peace. We're not itching for a fight. We don't need your shade, and we don't need your light. We know charisma isn't contagious, and most rules are egregious. We're catabolic women. We've known the refuge of human arms, the comfort of bathroom floors. We've stormed out of rooms. We've thrown open the doors. We figured the tricks to turn rage into celebration. We know why the oldest god dances at every cremation. We've kissed in the rose garden. We've been the belles of the ball. We've hidden under bed covers, and we've stood tall. We're not interested in camouflage or self-revelation. We're not looking for a bargain or an invitation. We're capable of stillness, even as we gallivant, capable of wisdom, even as we rant. Look into our eyes, you'll see we're almost through. We can be kind, but we're not really thinking of you. We don't remember names and we don't do Sudoku. We are losing EQ and IQ, forgetting to say please and thank you. We're catabolic women. We've never ticked the right boxes. We've never filled out the forms. Our dharma is tepid, our politics lukewarm. We've had enough of earnestness and indignation, but still keep the faith in conversation. We are wily Easterners enough to argue nirvana and bhakti, talk yin and yang, Shiva and Shakti. When we are denied a visa, we fall back on astral travel. And when samsara gets intense, we simply unravel. We are unbuilding now, unperpetuating, unfortifying, disintegrating. We are caterwauling, catastrophic, shambolic, cataclysmic, catabolic women. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Arundhati. That was a beautiful reading. I'm really glad you read that first poem, which is the first poem in this book. I like it a lot. It's a pleasure now to introduce our next readers. Najwan Darwish is a Palestinian poet born in Jerusalem. He published his first book of poetry in 2000 and has been an important literary figure ever since. He's published 8 books in Arabic, and his work has been translated into over 20 languages. New York Review Books, which published the English translation of his collection Nothing More to Lose in 2014, describes him as, quote, one of the foremost Arabic language poets of his generation. Darwish has co-founded and directed cultural projects throughout the Arab world and served as the literary advisor to the Palestine Festival of Literature. He has held many key positions in cultural journalism and has been the chief cultural editor of the Arabic language London-based newspaper Al Arabi Al Jadid since 2014. Darwish lives between Jerusalem and Haifa. And his 2 translators, brought together by the Poetry Translation Center to produce this beautiful new book, are Atef Alshaer, who is an academic, translator, and poet. He's a senior lecturer in Arabic studies at the University of Westminster and has written a number of books in the fields of language, literature, and politics, including Poetry and Politics in the Modern Arab World. Our second translator, though I believe they're equals, is Paul Batchelor, a poet born in Northumberland. He's the author of the pamphlet To Photograph a Snow Crystal from Smith Doorstop and The Sinking Road, also published by Bloodaxe in 2008. He has won the Time Stephen Spender Prize for Translation and the Edwin Morgan International Poetry Prize, and he writes criticism for both The Guardian and the TLS. Greetings, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us today. Looking forward to hearing your poems, Najwan.
مساء الخير, good evening. عناق مرتبك ومبلل. يدي تمزقت وهي تحاول معانقة جبال ووديان وسهول. والبحر الذي أحببته أغرقني مرارا، وما كان جسد العاشق صار جثة تطفو على المياه. مرتبك ومبلل، جثتي هي الأخرى تمد ذراعها مستميتة لعناق البحر الذي أغرقها.
Embrace. Confused, wet through, my hands torn, reaching to embrace mountains, valleys and plains, and the sea that I loved, that drowned me over and over. The body of the lover has become a corpse afloat on the water. Confused, wet through, my corpse also stretches out its arms, clutching to embrace the sea that drowns it.
في مهرجان شعري أمام كل شاعر اسم بلاده، ولم يكن وراء اسمي سوى جيروسالم. كم هو مرعب اسمك يا بلاد الصغيرة، التي لم يبق لي سوى اسمها أنام فيه وأستيقظ. اسمها الذي مثل سفينة لا أمل لها بالوصول ولا بالرجوع. لا تصل ولا ترجع، لا تصل ولا تغرق.
The Poetry Festival. In front of each poet, their country's name. Next to my name, nothing but Jerusalem. How frightening your name must be, my little country. Nothing remains of you but the name. I sleep and I walk with it. Your name like a boat with no hope of arrival or return. It neither arrives nor returns. It neither arrives nor drowns.
أمام كنيسة في مستوطنة أنتيغوا. فلاحة فلسطينية ثكلت إلها، حملت النور والظلمة إلى بلاد المايا والأزتك. منذ 2000 سنة وهم يمنعون تمثالها من الكلام، يمنعونها من أن تقول قصتها. فلاحة فلسطينية صغيرة ثكلت إلها وتغربت منذ 2000 سنة وهي مقيدة بالحجر والطين، سجينة تماثيلها الصامتة. لا تتكلم التي ثكلت إلها إلا حين يصل زائر من قريتها، يحمل قنان الزيت وطحين اللجوء، عنبا ذابلا من الخليل، وشباكا ممزقة من بحر الجليل. فلاحة ثكلى تنزل من تمثالها وتمسح دموع الزائر.
In front of a church in the settlement of Antigua, a Palestinian peasant girl mourned a god. She carried light and darkness to the country of the Maya and the Aztecs. For 2,000 years, they have banned her statue from speaking and prohibited her from telling her story. A young Palestinian peasant girl mourned a god and was exiled for 2,000 years, tied to stones and mud. Imprisoned in her silent statue, she does not talk, the one who mourned a god, except when a visitor from her village arrives, carrying olive oil, withered grapes from Hebron, the flower of refugees, and torn nets from the Sea of Galilee. A bereaved peasant girl steps down from her statue to wipe away the visitor's tears.
عن طفولتي. ولم أكن أسأل عن طفولتي ولا أخبار المحكمة هناك حيث رفعنا مرة دعوى ضد الذين سرقوها.
About my childhood, I didn't ask about my childhood or about the court's verdict. After we had presented our case against those who stole it.
أنا شبح وأعرف عما أتحدث. خطر لي بينما الأمطار تساقط فوق أشجار آسيوية أسفل سور الصين، بينما نحن هناك نشرب الشاي وننصت ناعسين لقصائد بعضنا، خطر لي أن أقول لهم: نحن أشباح ها هنا. تتجمع الأشباح لتتدفأ، تسير في جماعات لأنها تعرف أنها ليست من الجماعة. أنا شبح وأعرف عما أتحدث. خطر لي وكتمت الخاطر. فالأشباح تعرف هذا ولا تحب أن تسمعه من أحد. الأشباح تحاول أن تنسى، وحين تلتقي في جماعات فهي تلتقي لتنسى، تشرب الشاي وتقرأ القصائد على مسامع بعضها لتنسى. نحن الآن أسفل سور الصين والأمطار تساقط، الشاي يوشك أن ينتهي، وكذلك القصائد. أنا شبح وأعرف عما أتحدث.
I am a ghost and I know what I'm talking about. It occurred to me as rain was falling on the trees by the Great Wall of China, where we were drinking tea and listening sleepily to each other's poems. It occurred to me to tell them, we are ghosts here. Ghosts gather together to keep warm. They walk in groups, for they know they don't belong. I am a ghost and I know what I'm talking about. It occurred to me, but I suppressed the thought. Ghosts know this already. They do not like to hear anyone speak of it. Ghosts try to forget, and when they meet in groups, they meet to forget. They drink tea and recite poems to each other to forget. We are here now by the Great Wall of China. Rain is falling and our tea is about to end. The poems as well. I am a ghost and I know what I'm talking about.
وجه صديق إلى جون بيرجر. وجه صديق على رف تاريخ الفن في مكتبة غريبة. وجه صديق من أيام بيوت من حجر، من أيام صيف القرى، من تلك الأرض التي قطعت وريدك منذ زمن لم تعد تتذكره، تلك الأرض التي دفنتك وبعثتك مرارا، وأحيانا كانت تدفنك ولا تبعثك، وأحيانا كنت تتوسل إليها أن تدفنك. ما هو تاريخ الفن أصلا إن لم يكن وجه صديق؟
The face of a friend for John Berger, the face of a friend on a shelf of art history books in a strange library, the face of a friend from days when the house was made of stone, from days when the village was made of summer, from land that cut you off at the rest, in a time you no longer remember, land that buried you and resurrected you, buried you and resurrected you. And sometimes it buried you without resurrecting you, and sometimes you begged it to bury you. What is the history of art if not the face of a friend?
وأسمع اهرب، وأسمع صوتا يقول لي اهرب، واترك جزيرة الإنجليز وراءك. لا شيء تنتمي إليه سوى هذا المذياع المقلد بإتقان، سوى سخان القهوة، سوى أشجار الحديقة المخططة على حرير السماء. وأسمع الصوت بلغات أعرفها وأخرى أجهلها. اهرب واترك وراءك الباصات الحمراء المتهالكة، سكك القطارات الصدئة، هذه الأمة المفجوعة بصباح العمل، هذه العائلة التي تعلق صورة رأس المال في غرفة الجلوس كأنه والدها. اهرب من هذه الجزيرة، لا شيء وراءك سوى الشبابيك، شبابيك على مد النظر، شبابيك في النهار وشبابيك في الليل، واجهات مطفأة لآلام مضاءة، واجهات مضيئة لآلام مطفأة. وتسمع الصوت اهرب بجميع لغات سكان المدينة الهاربين من أحلام طفولاتهم، من آلام مستعمرات تحولت تواقيع باردة في كتب مات مؤلفوها. أولئك الهاربون ونسوا مما هربوا، الذين يجبنون عن قطع الشارع يستجمعون الآن جبنهم ويصرخون اهرب.
Escape. I hear a voice addressing me. Escape. Leave the English island behind you. You belong to nothing but this knockoff radio, nothing but the coffee pot, nothing but the garden's trees outlined against a silken sky. And I hear voices speak in languages that I know and in languages that I do not know. Escape. Leave behind you the clapped out red buses, the rusty train tracks, this nation obsessed with morning work, this family which hangs a picture of capitalism in the living room as if it were an ancestor. Escape from this island. There are only windows behind you, windows as far as you can see, daylight windows, nighttime windows, dull facades for bright panes, bright facades for dull panes. And you hear the voices. Escape. In every language of the city, from those still fleeing their childhood dreams, from the pain of colonies that turn to cold signatures as their authors die, the escapees who have forgotten what they escaped, too cowardly now to cross the street, they gather all their cowardice together and scream, escape.
Wow, thank all three of you. That was really wonderful. I believe you guys are finished for now, right? Is that correct?
Yeah.
Arundhati, if you'd like to join us again, we'll have a little conversation. And for any of you watching on YouTube, please remember that you can drop questions there in the comments and ask these poets and poet translators questions of your own. Hi there, Arundhati. I was thinking of asking you the first question, and it's in reference to the first poem you read about meeting poets in their books rather than in person. And it's in reference to your life, as I understand it, as a woman who lives between places, between Bombay and New York and other parts of India at certain times of the year, and our current times when, of course, we're having this festival entirely online, and it's not safe to meet poets in person for another different reason. Have you found that restrictions or limitations on your travel have affected the way you're writing or the way you're inspired, as I imagine much of your inspiration must come from your movement between these places, or in the content of what you're writing now?
It's a good question, David, and I'm not sure I have an answer yet, really. You know, these past months have been difficult, and there have been times when I've just not written and not pushed myself to write because there was almost a kind of nausea at the sight of the laptop. So I've stayed away. And yes, I'm sure that there are differences in the way I will write and in the little that I have written. It's very difficult to go unaffected by this time. One of the things I've found is that it's been a time that's compelled me to kind of live in my body a lot more, you know, just mainly because we're leading otherwise such disembodied lives. I think just eating and exercising and sleeping take on a new significance altogether. So how that will leak into the poetry, it's just too too early to say, David. I mean, I have poems, but I don't think, I'd probably be falsifying things if I drew conclusions so quickly.
That makes a lot of sense to me, Arundhati. Thank you. I guess I'll begin with you three gentlemen with an obvious question, perhaps, but one that I'm always interested in as a translator myself, and as someone who's done quite a bit of collaborative translation, both with the Poetry Translation Center, which has long paired individuals that they think will bring the necessary skills to bring a poet's work into English. How did you, Paul, and you, Atef, work together to translate Najwan's poems? What was that like?
Well, I'll just quickly say that, well, while your introduction was very kind in saying that Atef and I were equal translators, I don't think that's really true. And Atef was very much the lead translator, and I was in a sort of supporting role on this project, and very happy to be part of it and in that role. So we tended to work by Atef drawing up a translation from the original, and then we would discuss that as a sort of secondary stage. So I'm going to hand over to Atef to talk more about that first stage.
No, thank you so much, David, for your introduction. Indeed, it was really a very it was indeed a very collaborative, work between Paul and myself. Basically, Najwan sent me a number of poems that I have to select some of them. They're really all, very good, and they all can be translated, but we have a number of poems to translate because to fit the number of pages and so on. And I selected these based on the diversity of themes they cover and the diversity of places and experiences they kind of evoke. And then I did a first translation of these and handed them then over to Paul, and then we deliberated over phrases, sentences, and rewrote them in certain places so as to make the poem, read as much naturally in English as possible, but at the same time to keep faithful to the original text as well and what it says. So that was, I think, is the balance that we try perhaps to strike, is somehow to transfer the Arabic into English seamlessly and preserve the integrity of the Arabic, but also and the Arabic as a sort of sense and sound and meaning, and also bring it out in a form in English where the tone, the coherence, the integrity of the poem also in English stands in its own right. So that was really the process, and it took a bit of time. We went back and forth sometimes with some poems, but it was very, very productive and very good, collaboration with Paul and Najwan, obviously, and others who joined.
Yes, it can be both a blessing and a curse when the poet you're translating speaks English as well as Najwan does. Yes. I know my own experience, but I think he's mostly a blessing. I have a suspicion. A related question from YouTube, from Ben Ray, who asks, how important is it for the translator to understand the context of the poem and the landscape it describes? Is it important, or do you only focus on the poem itself? And Arundhati, I'd like to welcome you to answer this question too, as I know you've translated and been translated.
If I were to answer that, shall I go first?
Sure.
One of the other?
Yeah.
No, I'm fine with going later. So just tell us when we ought to come in.
Go ahead, Arundhati. Why don't you begin?
Okay. The translations that I've done have largely been from medieval mystic poetry of India. And was it important to know the context? Absolutely. I don't think it would have been possible. I wouldn't have been drawn to these poems if it wasn't for the context in many ways. And there are lots of, there are just so many decisions one has to make as translator, which in fact are very deeply influenced by the context. If you don't have a sense of the context, I think it's often easy to make the superficial decision or a glib decision to sound, it can sound fluent and easy and sometimes facile, but it doesn't often do justice to the mainsprings of the original. So does that mean that one has to in some way be enslaved by the original? No, but it certainly means that one has to be deeply sensitive to the context from which it arose. It's very easy, for instance, to make certain medieval women mystics sound like contemporary feminists, to give you an example. There's a temptation to do that, but they're not. It's very easy also to kind of whitewash the sacred aspects of that poetry to make it more acceptable, to try and make it sound like they weren't having personal relationships with local gods, but in fact they were, with very embodied gods. So to try and universalize them too easily would be to do them a great disservice. So I think it's about finding ways to allow them to speak to a modern reader, but at the same time, not to erase their context.
I would certainly echo what Arundhati so eloquently just said. I think the context is extremely important. I think it's very almost, in certain poems, in certain cases, it's almost impossible perhaps to translate without the context, because most of these poems are embedded within a particular tradition. And also embedded within particular sittings, and knowing the context of these sitting and the context of the tradition is extremely significant to transfer the meaning and the sense of the poem as well. So I think there is no way that one could translate actually a lot of these poems and sounds without the context. It's just and the context what does the context mean? The context means sound, it means background information like historical information. It can mean particular allusions to particular poets. So it really means quite a combination of these elements, as the case in these poems. For example, there is a reference to Al-Mutanabbi in one of Najwan's poems, but Al-Mutanabbi is not mentioned in the poem as such. It's just an allusion to it. So without knowing this is from Al-Mutanabbi, it's hard to translate. Basically, it just comes across as randomly. Where if you put Al-Ma'arri, it's also another reference to allusion to Al-Ma'arri, another great medieval Arab poet. All these references, sometimes Islamic or Christian references, so these certainly are part of the context. In addition to the poem itself, to the sound of the poem itself, that it is embedded within a tradition that one needs to somehow be equipped with at least some knowledge of in order to be able to deal with the text as faithfully as possible. So my answer, just to really echo what Arundhati said, that is very important.
I'll echo you both and say yes. Najwan's book Embrace begins with the poem Variation on a Line by Al-Ma'arri. So that's a sort of gesture, I think, to the fact that he's working in a tradition, and if the translator doesn't know that tradition very well, then there are all kinds of things he or she will miss. And I didn't and don't know that tradition very well, though I did have help in grasping the context from this book. I hope Atef won't mind me giving a. Can you say that?
That's very kind.
The background is trying its best to make it invisible, but this is called A Map of Absence, and it is an anthology that Atef edited, and I strongly recommend it. It's a wonderful book to give you a sense of the literary and the political context that Najwan is working in.
Thank you, Paul. That's very kind. I didn't expect that. It was very nice.
Seems fitting that on a panel about translation and international literature, we should encounter all of these echoes. And it's really interesting what you were saying, Atef, about these allusions. And I was thinking when you were talking about that, about an allusion in a poem by the Sudanese poet Al-Sadiq al-Radi, who the PTC has also translated quite a bit. He alludes to the mystic from, I believe, the 10th century, Al-Hallaj, but without mentioning him by name, a kind of oblique allusion that, you know, fortunately the person I was reading the poem with recognized it, but I never would have in a million years. And it is that question, how, you know, do we put more text into the poem than was in the original? Have you ever done that, Atef? Have you ever added explanation or almost explication that wasn't there, if you could do so subtly?
It's actually quite a hard question. Often not really, just I try to make the text to speak for itself. But sometimes, like, there are certain places where the urge to add something, to have a footnote or to add something of this sort is there, because really for another reader from another tradition, it's very, very hard to see where the allusion comes from. So it can be helpful. But I think it's sort of, I think we have agreed when we have the discussion, Paul and I and Najwan and Ed later, that maybe it's better not to include references just to make the poem read for themselves, and somehow they do because of just the way the poem is composed. It does have a traditional feel to it. It does have that background embedded in it, but at the same time, the poem speaks for itself as a modern text. It builds on a tradition, but it's not overwhelmed by it as such. And that's why actually these poems are very, very sort of very well done in Arabic. And I could say in English maybe, but this I shouldn't promote it too much. This could be counted as arrogance. But to come back to the point, I think is just to make the text read, you know, in English without too much background information that the reader themselves can look up for if they are interested, if they want to see more. But the poem has a point to make now, and it makes it in the present time, which the reader, I guess, can relate to because of the...
Is that frozen for everyone else?
I want to add a line, if I may, David. I just want to say I agree with that. And I think, you know, it's often a problem to try and pack. The context is something for you to know. It's not for something, it's not meant to be flaunted or exhibited in the poem. It has to be in some way implicit in the poem and not spelt out beyond a point. So in fact, I was actually thinking of the poem that I read earlier today, How to Read Indian Myths. That's about as close as I come to a handbook to reading, unpacking some of the poems. But I wouldn't, you know, needlessly footnote a poem, you know, or I'd keep them very minimal if I had to. And I certainly don't italicize. So even when I smuggle in words from other Indian languages, I often don't italicize because I want it to be read as almost an integral part of this text. It seems a bit strange perhaps at times, and yet it's not so strange after all when you read it. It's part of the English text.
That's very interesting. Atef, I'll just say that I think I can give you some relatively objective affirmation that I think the English language poems are very good as well.
Oh, thank you.
This next question is for both Arundhati and Najwan, and comes from Sarah G. Her question is, the variety of subject matter is something running through both of your readings and collections. Is that something you think about when bringing poems together, or was it more about timing? Najwan, do you want to answer that first?
The sound.
You're muted.
You're muted.
Let Arundhati first.
Okay.
No, Najwan, I think we want to hear your voice. Come on.
Yeah,
After you, always ladies first.
No. Najwan, we want to hear you. Come on, go for it.
To be honest, I think most of the prose on poetry is extra, and in many cases not very much. We wouldn't add much. What make a difference in a process of translation if we reach a result, and I think it was very much reached in the translation of Atef and Paul. I stopped mixing between the Arabic and English. So not really much to say from my side. I'm just thankful to all of you, to Atef and Paul for the translation, for Ed and Poetry Translation Center, and for the organizers of this event, and for you personally, David, for hosting this meeting. And then we would now hear something more useful from Arundhati.
I think it's a good question, but it's also a difficult one to answer, because I think for me, every poetry collection has been separated by about 5 years, 4 to 5 years. That's about as much time as it takes for me to even start putting a manuscript together. And at the time that I'm putting the manuscript together, I'm always amazed by the fact that I thought I was leading a fairly I was having varied life experiences and so on, but I've always found that the poems seem to return to a few basic recurrent themes. And that's how I know that they kind of belong together, they hang together in a manuscript. They are diverse, I'm glad that you said so, and I'm glad for that observation. But yes, it has to do with the choices one makes at a reading. So I think she's also asked, was that more about timing? It's certainly about the choices. You want to offer a flavor of diverse concerns when you're doing a reading. And if it's offered a sense of that diversity, I'm grateful. But I actually have a feeling you'll find certain recurrent themes in this book: intimacy, conversation, journeys, again and again in different ways.
Thank you both. And I know in the case of Najwan's most recent book that you, Atef, as translator, but also editor in a certain sense, had something to do with the selection of the poems. Is that right?
The selection of this book, you mean? Yeah, certainly. I've chosen I have selected these poems from a larger sort of pool of poems. And I think the eco-diversity of places, Najwan's experience in Palestine, elsewhere, and also his experience with various cultures, various traditions, whether religious traditions, Islamic, Jewish, Judaic, Muslim, Christian, etc. So the diversity was very important. But I think I agree with Arundhati. There is something that links somehow these poems, which is the voice itself, the nature of the voice, the way it expresses. I'm speaking more like I'm using you as an object now, Najwan, but the way Najwan expresses himself, there is sort of a connecting element between energy to his poem, which is somehow, it's very rooted in a place and very rooted in a tradition, but very diverse in terms of the literary allusions and in terms of the places that it refers to. So something from Latin America, then to Palestine, a friend like John Berger. All of these are concerns that come across as sort of making up the experience of the poet in this case. So I agree there's diversity to do with the experience of the poet, but there's also something shared, something that one can detect as the underlying latent energy of the poet as from a country like Palestine with all its baggage and its problem, but also the poet as a wanderer and traveler in this case in various places and registering deeply the experience that he has with these places. And then maybe sometimes also linking it to sort of the native homeland that he comes from, perhaps unconsciously, but that's the way it comes across, that it's deeply devoted to people and to traditions and to cultures, which is vividly reflected in this selection.
Yeah, thank you, Atef. I think what you mentioned too is that the quality of being a wanderer or a traveler is also something that unites these two poets, each in their distinct way. But one of the things I've enjoyed about reading your books, and I'll remind our audience that links to those books are on the YouTube channel, is the way that they've conversed while each being very different. I think they are very much books by poets who clearly find at least some of their inspiration in their moving through the world. And I really enjoyed that. We have a question from Delaina Haslam, who thanks us for this wonderful events, and then asks if Paul or Atef can recall any examples from their collaboration in which they understood a poem or a word or phrase differently. And I'm interested to hear from you both because you're both so humble. I'm wondering how that negotiation would work. Paul, do you recall anything like that?
Yeah, there were many small points at which we might. Well, I tended to sort of pull in the direction of establishing a sort of a tone in English that I thought would sort of suited the poem as I could understand it and seemed resonant and so on. And Atef would tend to pull more towards staying as close as possible to the original, which sounds straightforward, but of course it isn't, because sometimes staying word for word close to the original will give you a phrase or a line that is wildly different from the original, particularly in its tone. So there were sort of a series of little decisions that we had to make. But one that comes to mind is the opening line of the title poem, Embrace, the line is now confused, wet through. And I know originally I think I'd suggested bewildered instead of confused as the word. And I realized afterwards I was thinking of the Michael Longley poem Wounds, which is a great poem that Embrace sort of reminded me of, and it uses wild and bewildered in a very particular ways, and I think I was trying to allude to a bit of that. But then it just seemed too sort of ornate a word. The tone wasn't right, and when Najwan contributed to the process, he didn't like bewildered either, and confused seemed much more direct and in keeping with the actual poem. I think I had something else for wet through as well. I think that I'd said soaked to the skin, which is a bit flowery, and Atef originally had drenched, which I thought was perhaps too sort of flatly prosaic in English. We tend to say I'm drenched in a sort of slightly comic way. And that seemed to flatten the tone or puncture the tone in a way. So we ended up compromising on this, confused, wet through. It's a tiny little moment in the poem, but there's quite a bit of discussion over it to get it right.
And there were some times when we have like lines where somehow my first impression of them turned out not to be what it is. So we have to go back to Najwan in this case to help us, to help me in the first instance to really understand it better, and then we worked again on making it, what it is in Arabic. And so I think really the three of us somehow we work together. It's as I said, collaborative approach. I did the first version, but then it went around and so on. So because Najwan's poems, I mean, there is perhaps a feature that it divides sometimes certain phrases or certain uses of language, certain syntax and structure sort of defies the first impression. Your impression of it would be something, but then you have to work again and again to make concrete really this first impression to make it accurate. And sometimes it wasn't, and we worked around that together. On certain phrases. I mean, it would be complex to go into examples and so on, but just gives you an example of how, well, actually how pleasant, but also time consuming working on poetry is. But ultimately, the product outcome is worthwhile. So
yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I really like those examples. I think the way Paul describes thinking about word choice and, when would I use this word? When would I use drenched? When would I use soaked to the skin? When would I use wet through? I think those are really fun questions to begin asking in a collaborative translation relationship too, because the answers are a little bit different based on where we're from, based on our experience. And it really gets you down to the brass tacks of language and asking yourself for me at least, as both a poet and a translator, I may do things by instinct in a poem of my own, but when I'm translating, I actually have to think more critically about why I would make a decision or not. And I think that's an interesting contrast, and one that's proven very, very productive for me, and very enlightening too. I think we have time for one final question, and I'd like to pose it to Najwan and Arundhati, but of course, Paul and Atef, if you have anything to add, please feel free. I'd been thinking as I read through both of your collections too about, it's clear that you're in, I don't like to ask poets who their influences are. For one, I think we're often not quite sure, or they're not who we think they are. But I do like the idea of a collection or a poet's work being in conversation with other poets' work. And I know both of you have poems dedicated to other poets. Atef, when speaking about Najwan's work earlier, was talking about the various traditions that inform his work. And I guess just in a very broad sense, although I would be happy to hear, if one of you says, my book is in conversation with this book or this poet. But I wondered very broadly if you could speak about the traditions you see yourselves belonging to or not, rebelling against perhaps, and some of the writers or works that you consider yourself to be in conversation with.
Najwan, do you want to go first? Okay. I grew up in Bombay, David. It's crazy, it's a city of a bhelpuri of languages, which is really one big chutney of languages, an exciting city to be in. But I grew up South Indian in a Western Indian city with those cadences of multiple languages around me, all of which in some way percolated, I'm sure, into my life and into my work. At the same time, I was a student of English literature, so I grew up with an Anglo-American canon that was very much part of my life. I'd say that, growing up, it was voices as diverse as, Wallace Stevens, T.S. Eliot, John Donne, the Zen poets, and many, many more, including many of the poets from Bombay, some of whom are actually mentioned. Eunice D'Souza, who's mentioned in that first poem, is a Bombay poet. So I was very aware that I was part of a whole ecosystem, in a sense, of poets who wrote in English as well, Anglophone poets in Bombay, but also Marathi poets, Gujarati poets, Hindi poets around me as well. Several of them, modern voices, the modern voices in these languages. But I think it was later in my life, probably, I'd say about 15 or 20 years ago, that I discovered for myself another whole set of literary ancestors whom I had been very dimly aware of growing up, because I was very involved with classical dance, and their poetry was an integral part of the classical dance repertoire in India. These were the Bhakti poets whom you mentioned earlier, and I've actually edited an anthology of Bhakti poetry. Bhakti literally means devotion. So these were the medieval devotional poets of India, the mystic poets. And what excited me much later in my life, as a spiritual journey assumed a certain importance in my life, was just realizing how exciting these voices were. They weren't tame, goody-goody voices. They weren't voices of servile adoration to the divine. That's not the kind of poetry they wrote. This was a spirited, passionate, erotic, argumentative conversation with God. And that's the poetry that I think in many ways was an important rediscovery. And that's been an important part of my literary ancestry, conscious literary ancestry.
Wonderful. Thank you, Arundhati. What about you, Najwan?
I think, David, this is the impossible question. And there is impossible answer for it for simple reason, because it's about who you are. When you are talking about your influences or your ancestors, it's defining who you are, and it's important to define who you are. But this is a long process, I guess. In my case, I would try to make simple answers. One of them, I would say, I am the product of Arabic poetry. The whole history of Arabic poetry, I am the product of that. I am the product of all the Arab poets who wrote before me. And I'm trying to continue their journey. It's just poetry is a journey. We have ancestors who were making the journey, and we are continuing the journey. But in my case, they are not only Arabs. They are much of them from the East, much of them from my part of the world, from the Mediterranean, from Persia and Turkey and India. And of course, because of this global moment we are living, everyone is open toward the rest of the world. So nowadays, you couldn't find a poet who's only belong to his tradition. We become like by force even have to do with other traditions. Like, it's not a choice to not be or to not know the Western poetic traditions. So in West Europe or in East Europe or in America, and the same with Latin America. I think some of the greatest influences, I got them from Latin America as well, and from contemporary poets, not just from the tradition. And I think as much as you can adjust as a poet, as much as you can digest from your tradition and other traditions, as much as you would gain qualities as a poet. And the tragedy of the humans, that their life is quite short. We have 40, 50, 60, if you are very lucky, you would reach 80, to understand or to reach or to learn about these traditions and to live them. So the secret of creativity has to do with the amount of material that you can get access to in such short life. And I'm talking about not just technical access to heritage, but also to live it, to be able to suffer that tradition and to get into their troubles and to make it something contemporary in your work. And I think all what I am doing, at least, is an attempt to pay back the debt to other poets, to my ancestors, and also to contemporary poets. I am indebted to. I'm every good poem I'm writing, it should be inspired by a certain a poet or a certain person I met. It's also because a lot of humans are poets, even they may not wrote poetry, but they are poets as well.
Thank you, Najwan. That's a really nuanced and beautiful answer. And it's also really interesting, Arundhati, to hear about your context and the multiplicity of influences. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions today. I'd like to thank all four of our participants and remind our viewers that you can acquire their books through the links on the YouTube channel. I'd like to thank the Poetry Translation Center for sponsoring this event, and I'd like to thank the festival organizers for putting it on. And I'll also encourage you to stick around, as the festival has two more great events this evening. The Poetry Business New Poets Prize, which is next, and then Poetry and Climate Change, featuring Carrie Eder and Caleb Parkin. Thank you so much for joining us today. Have a wonderful evening.
can we talk now and say bye to each other?